Welcome to this week's edition of the Monocle Banking Podcast, curated by Monocle Solutions, where we balance the books in the dynamic world of finance. I'm your host, Michael Avery, and for the past few weeks, I've been steering you through the ever-shifting story of the political economy in South Africa. So whether you're a finance professional, an enthusiast, or just someone who simply wants to stay informed about the world, you're in the right place. Now, South Africa's banking sector and finance broadly is inextricably interwoven into the political economy. And I recall a lecture by Nick Binedell, former Dean of Gibbs, during which he asked his students, a small group of banking execs, what their goal was and what their strategy was. And they all said they were competing to be the biggest and best bank in the country. Not many had much of a political appetite. But he, after that, said if they didn't become more conscientized and active, they might all just end up competing to be the biggest bank in Zimbabwe, which I just think was an apt reminder that there can be no successful business in an unsuccessful country or unsuccessful democracy. Well, my guest this week certainly has a unique perspective on South Africa's political economy, having worked inside the ANC's Department of Economic Planning to Director General of the Department of Arts, Culture, Science and Technology, and then heading into business to lead some of the country's largest listed companies, construction firm Avenge to Prime Media, and then lastly as chair of FirstRand before he resigned to pursue his political aspirations, spearheading a new party called Change Starts Now, which has just announced it won't be competing in these elections. But I'm sure this isn't the end of the story. Roger Jardine, welcome to the podcast.
Great. Thank you very much for having me.
Let's go all the way back, because I think it's important to understand an individual's upbringing and context, because it often shapes our worldview. Can you just share some insights into your upbringing in Rivoli, particularly how it shaped your understanding of social justice and activism, and given your father Bill's involvement in the struggle against apartheid?
Great, thank you. Well, it actually starts with my grandmother, Rose Jardine, who worked with Solly Sachs. He was the father of Judge Albie Sachs. They were colleagues in the Garment Workers Union. And in 1952, my grandmother was part of a march to release Solly Sachs from detention. And she was brutally beaten up that day. In our family folklore, that's regarded as the turning point in political activism. And so my grandmother certainly shaped our family's political outlook, which my father then took on, and in turn, our generations. So I'm very pleased and proud to be sort of the third generation that's focused on not just social justice itself, but on the general well-being of people in this country. And certainly, you know, in Rivoli and then moving to Eldorado Park later, just being surrounded by a social environment. My father always used to say, just because of the Group Areas Act, I don't want the Group Areas Act to define your life's journey. We need to think outside of what was predetermined for us by apartheid legislation. So whether it was through community activism, my family is also a very big sporting family, mainly in rugby, where we're still very much involved. Just seeing all of those outlets as platforms for being socially engaged. So I grew up in a home where we had constant conversations. In fact, one of the memories I have distinctly as sort of a late teenager is when the Springboks played in New Zealand. The Reverend Stoffile left for New Zealand from our home in Eldorado Park. You remember the famous flower bomb.
Yeah.
Yes. So, I was around all of that political activism and discussion. So it certainly shaped my outlook.
And, sport and politics have often been intertwined in South Africa's history. And I just think most recently of the lessons that we could glean from the way the Springbok team has managed to transform, has managed to present the best of a very cosmopolitan society in lifting the Webb Ellis in consecutive World Cups. And I think Rassie Erasmus should be applauded for that. Given your sporting background, and I think your father worked a little bit with Louis Late as well, who became something of a funder for the DA as well, do you think that we have this ability as South Africans to rally around sporting causes that tend to unite us, and then we go back into our political kraal, so to speak, and we miss a trick here in building a South African identity or common vision?
Yeah, so my father was the convener of the national team for the South African Rugby Union pre-Unity. That was the non-racial rugby union. And then there was the South African Rugby Board led by Danny Craven. And after Unity, my dad became one of the panelist Springbok selection team for the 95 World Cup. And when all of that was happening, I was entering the government of national unity, working across the aisle, if you will. So it made for very interesting dinner table conversations. And certainly when we look at where the Springbok team is today, and even if you look at the crowds attending, say, Lions matches at Ellis Park, we can see on and off the field a decisive shift in terms of how the country is reflected and the performance on the field. You can do as much as you want to off the field, but when the team's not performing, everybody's glum and the outlook doesn't look too rosy. So I think it's just fantastic that if you take a player like Mapimpi, who is a darling of South African rugby, he was spotted in a club competition and then went on to World Cup glory in Japan and even in France. So, yeah, I think we've made some enormous strides in that regard.
I just love it. I love the fact that we have Zumpi as an unofficial anthem and the Amaguijo, and bringing that into South African rugby, which for many years was seen as kind of a bastion of the old order and Afrikanerdom and all of that. It has absolutely thrown that off. But to your earlier point, it starts with winning on the field. And I guess, Roger, just to dive straight into the meat of our conversation, as business in South Africa, there's a feeling that we've put the very necessary policy aims and objectives of transformation ahead of the economic growth horse. So we've put the cart in front of the horse. Yes, we need to transform. Yes, we need to alter the apartheid spatial history and legacy that we're dealing with, both physically and metaphorically. But you can't do that without a growing economy. And so there's almost been a policy mismatch in the way we've approached things. What do you see as some of the key underpinnings behind South Africa's tepid economic growth?
I think transformation and growth are not mutually exclusive terms. It's how they applied. So let's take, for example, the issue of procurement. There are, and I know this personally, there are a number of bona fide black investors in companies in South Africa who have gone on risk to invest in companies that have been around for a long time and who know what they are doing. And often those companies are not included when it comes to procurement. They can potentially be written off as legacy old white companies. And then what happens is 3 or 4 guys with no real capacity or experience would get a major contract, and everyone would call that inclusion. And then they would be unable to deliver on the contract. There are so many places where some villages and towns have had, they're onto their second or third water provision contract with still no water.
Yeah.
So I think governments around the world use procurement as leverage for strategic objectives. But certainly in South Africa, we have to revisit how this is applied here, because ultimately, we call it inclusion, but a lot of people are excluded from the basic services that is meant to reach them. So if you ask me in this whole debate, the first point that we need to get right is how procurement is leveraged. It's just gone wrong. People are paying the price for it.
So how, in your vision, and I find it very difficult to disagree with your analysis, it is in effect the execution of these policies that has undermined the spirit. If you look at BEE, for example, and the one you use is a very salient point around the way procurement has been used to benefit patronage networks, insiders, and not really given to a transformed company, but a company that can also do the job at the end of the day. And the proof is in the pudding, really. We see it around the country, dysfunctional municipalities, network industries that are rolling over in energy and water and roads and provision of basic services. How do we transform that process? How do we ensure that procurement is used to leverage change, but in a way that depoliticizes many of these key decisions?
Well, I think a good start is, if we look at the public service, we have to end cadre deployment. I remain convinced that the bulk of public servants are there to make a difference. People join the public service and then they get strangled or frustrated by a core at the top that have been put in there precisely to leverage certain outcomes. You know, it's 30 years later. There's a lot of graduates and people with experience in this country, both black and white, who would love to serve this country, who are avoiding the public service because it's just not a very attractive place to be. And if you look at other successful countries, the public service is a very prestigious job and a place to be. So I think it's one of the key levers that we need to tackle head on so that when people are appointed into senior roles, all South Africans who have skills and experience to offer are considered. And they, in turn, will be the right counterparty when dealing with big contractors and service providers and that sort of thing, because they'll know, yes, to look at the global, sort of the globular strategic objective around procurement, but they'll also know how to deal with things like value for money and will the service actually get to the village or the citizen out there. So there are a number of moving parts in getting this right. But I think a good start will be to revisit how do we professionalize our public service.
It's such an important point, and I've written about it recently for Business Day, the fact that we have recently seen the passing of the Public Service Amendment Bill in at least one of the Houses of Parliament, and arguably the most important reform in terms of all of the economic reforms that we've been talking about, which seeks to depoliticize the appointment of civil servants. And if we go back to 94, I think it was under the Public Service Act, which was one of the first pieces of legislation passed by the ANC even before the new constitution was ratified, we had this huge politicization of the civil service. And one can understand why. I think, there was the miracle of 94, but there was still a fair degree of lack of trust. And the ANC as a liberation movement and democratically elected government wanted to ensure that its policies and objectives were carried out through the civil service. But there was a wholesale, almost purge, if you call it will, of very capable civil servants. And in their stead, there are still many capable, but some political appointees and lackeys who probably don't have the right qualifications for the job. If a coalition is to form and unseat the ANC, how does one unscramble that particular egg if you're dealing with a civil service that owes its very existence and allegiance to the ANC?
Yeah, look, I don't want to make it sound easy because it's quite a big undertaking. In many countries around the world, when there's an election and a change of government, invariably certain positions change. I think in Washington, 1,000 top positions change overnight, and people understand that. But the core of the civil service remains in place. I think what's bedeviled our situation is that political texture to an appointment has gone beyond just the Director General, and it has seeped into the inner workings of the public service. And I would certainly start there and be very clear on which positions, like in the US and other places in the world, are subject to that kind of political value judgment. Having said that, in other parts of the world, a permanent secretary or a DG is a professional public servant, and they actually rotate through departments. And in our political fraught environment, that could be the model to go with because we are 30 years into our democracy. And what we've seen is even when a minister from the same party takes over a department, they still feel the need to bring their own Director General in to have that leverage. So I think we need to start right there in terms of how we professionalize the public service because it's such an important interface between society and government.
Such an important point that you make, and I think it's definitely through the state capture years was conscious strategy to undermine certain key departments, the churn that we saw at Director General level and other levels, and the ability, therefore, to insert one's own agenda into the public sphere. Take me back to late last year. You must have been having these conversations well ahead of the announcement that you would be stepping down from the chairmanship of FirstRand and forming, along with the other stalwarts, Change Starts Now. What drove that decision? Take me back to those conversations that led you to this point to say, right, I've got to throw my hat in the ring here. I can't just stand idly by anymore.
Yeah, so for the last few elections, I've had these sort of moments of just as a South African looking around me and becoming increasingly concerned with the trajectory of this country. I've certainly written about it extensively in many chairman's statements. And my decision was born out of a need to add my voice to the upcoming election in some form. Being institutionally bound, there's only so far that one can go. And so over much of last year, I spoke to my family and trusted friends and confidants about wanting to essentially leave FirstRand. My 9-year tenure, as per the Reserve Bank, will end in April 2027. It's had about 3 years left, and it was fantastic to be part of such an amazing institution. But in the end, I decided now is the time. I'm not a career politician. I really wanted to add my voice to this upcoming election. And so that was part of the conversations that I was having that led to that decision.
There was obviously some of a calculated risk here, given that there was this case before the Constitutional Court around scrapping the 15% signatures requirement for parties which aren't represented in any of the legislatures. So you took something of a gamble that the court would rule in your favor. What are the implications for your political ambitions and the future of this movement, given that the court ruling didn't go the way you would have hoped?
It was disappointing. Look, we were hoping, remember this matter was heard in December and the court ruled in respect of independent candidates. I must say, and I want to point out, we are not blaming the court for this. The court was dealt a matter from the political environment and the court deemed that it wasn't urgent. And that essentially meant that we would not meet those signature requirements. We launched in December. It's almost 3 months of building constituencies, getting going, etc. So quite onerous for us. We are regrouping. We've put out a manifesto which is rooted in social solidarity, and we'll continue to promote the ideas in that manifesto. Again, the intention was to intervene in this election. And so as change starts now, we will regroup and take a view on the way forward.
Given that, let's talk about the way forward just briefly before we go into the manifesto. Are you envisioning throwing your support behind other opposition parties? Do you see yourself still campaigning on the ground? How do you see the movement progressing into what is shaping to be a critical election, many likening this 2024 to our 1994? I'm not so sure I like the narrative around that, around regime change, because whether or not the ANC slips below 50, 45, it's still going to be a significant political force in South Africa. And I think to paint it as regime change and to paint the ANC as the enemy makes building future governments and coalitions very fraught and very difficult. How do you see your role in the build-up to this election?
So firstly, I think, language matters. In a democracy, political opposition cannot be referred to as enemies. So I agree with you entirely. People who do not share your views are political adversaries. They're not enemies, and should be seen as such, because I think it really speaks to the heart of our political culture and how we relate to each other, especially when we differ. So I fully agree with you. When it comes to other political parties, we will be saying to people, we have a vision of where society should be going. If you share this vision, and there are many people who do, hold this up to what other parties are saying and vote for the party that you think will best take that agenda forward. So no, we will not be endorsing any other political party as such, but we will be encouraging everyone to vote and to weigh the consequences of their vote and to hold it up against what we are saying the vision and the future should look like.
And then build into 2029 is what I'm hearing you say.
Yeah, so as change starts now, our plan was for this election, we will regroup and decide on how to take this forward. We have not reached the landing on that yet.
Talk to me about the manifesto, promises of a 500 billion rand redevelopment, proposals for tax increases largely for the wealthy as part of that social solidarity component. given what we've seen with the Laffer curve and what Edward Kieswetter, as the head of SARS, who's done a fantastic job of arresting the decline at SARS following the Tom Moyane years, has observed around the ability of South Africans to absorb any more tax increases. How would this be achieved, and how has it been received so far, particularly amongst business and the wealthy who would bear the brunt of this cost?
Well, we have had at least one top businessman saying this is a very credible plan in terms of taking us forward. I think the thing that we all have to weigh is there's increasing evidence that people are losing faith and hope in democracy. I think 70% of South Africans, as per Afrobarometer, have said they've lost faith or do not have faith in democracy. This led about $250 billionaires and millionaires earlier this year to actually write a letter saying that they feel they need to be taxed more to deal with social issues. Where this approach is coming from is basically saying we have a very serious social problem in this country. People are literally going to bed hungry. Malnutrition is life. Children are being stunted. I was in a roundtable with food security activists a few months ago, and one of them got up and said, people often say, show me your friends and I'll show you your future. Her view was, show me your height at the age of 2 and I'll show you your future. So we have constitutionally enshrined social protections. I don't think we can afford to take a linear view. Let's fix this, grow that, and then deal with this pressing social issues. So where the proposals have come from is basically to say, we think we can raise 500 billion rand through a series of levies. And remember, this is a 3-year program. What it potentially does is it helps to unlock growth at the current rate as our national income takes more pressure. We are possibly looking at sustainably higher tax increases to fund our social obligations. The trade-off here is this 3-year plan, which will go into unlocking growth, together with a very strong political will in terms of fixing SOEs, will lead to economic growth and could even over the medium to long term reduce taxes. So there's a trade-off, and people need to really think through this carefully. We think this is a credible plan to unlock growth because we can't go anywhere in terms of taking our country forward without growth, and we cannot ignore the pressing social issues at the same time.
Definitely agree with you on that point, in that it can't be linear. In fact, I think what we're seeing at the moment is this dissatisfaction and this discontent manifest around the so-called business fora or construction mafia, if you want to call them something else. Yeah. And I'm sure you're very aware and familiar with them with your work at Avenge. And part of that has come from sincere and genuine concerns and feeling locked out structurally from the economy. I think there's an extent of opportunism and criminality that has crept into it as well. But you can only hijack people and their genuine concerns if they really are disaffected. And so one has to have a dual track approach to grow the economy while catering for the needs of those who feel excluded, and also working on the base of the pyramid. Ricardo Hausmann has said this repeatedly. We need to work on our skills and our know-how, our human capital, and there's no way you can do that if you're talking about stunting in early childhood development. You just start with a handicap that can never be fixed. Given the complexity, and I think in many ways it's the politics of reform that often trips us up. And I'm reminded of what Jeremy Baskin said. He was worried already in 1996 that the government was too busy debating about growth and not busy enough making it happen. And we tend to be caught in this circular debate. Time seems to be of the essence, Roger. What do you say to businesses? Just last week, I had Duncan Artis of one of the top asset managers in the country, Alan Gray, saying that if there's an ANC EFF coalition, in his view, we become uninvestable, certainly to foreign investors. I'm not so sure pragmatic investors that invest in gross fixed capital formation, bricks and mortar type stuff, not just hot flows on the JSE, take such a view. But what is your view if we see an ANC EFF coalition for South Africa and its future over the next 5 years?
Let's just talk generically about a coalition government. There will have to be some very key conditions in place for investors to basically flee. And I think that will go to contracts, how they're honored, private property, the risk of expropriation. There will have to be some key assurances given to an investing public that if they put their money here, that the guardrails that they would expect in any other economy would be in place. So I don't think it's very helpful to conjure up scary scenarios. We can only work on the policy pronouncements of current parties and then take a view. I think ultimately, it's one thing to run for office, but once you get there, reality very quickly kicks in. So if those conditions are not held or respected, we could see some of that flight. Currently, this debate around an investor strike, which I don't agree with. The reason why you're not seeing greater investment in the domestic economy is that there just isn't a clear runway for capital to put their money in. So let me give you an example. When the government introduced the renewable energy rollout, phase 1, 2, and 3, and so on, over 210 billion rand of private capital, domestic and international, was mobilized. And that was around very clear rules and runway and understanding and a process that had a lot of integrity. So it is possible. But the erosion of governance and all of the concerns that have crept in over the last, call it 10 years, have undermined that. So that will have to be firmly in place for investors to see us as an attractive investor destination.
And a big hurdle remains our cost of capital, which is again constrained by the political economy. If we see where long-term bond yields are and where interest rates are because of factors that really emanate from policy choices that we've made, that hurdle rate for businesses to invest remains restrictive or prohibitive. If you're allocating capital, you'd rather not take that risk, and you get returns investing in 10-year government bonds, which is, to some extent, our bind at the moment with where we find the economic growth story heading and the inability to catalyze growth. Just to wrap things up, looking ahead, when you sit down, as I'm sure you do with business leaders, what would your key piece of advice for business in South Africa be navigating what seems to be an extremely dynamic and shifting political landscape this year in particular, especially considering what we've just discussed?
Well, I think the business needs to, your earlier comment, by the way, just brings into focus our manifesto again, because we need to work on how to fix South Africa's balance sheet, because continuing to take on debt at the rate that we have will just exacerbate that long-term bond yield curve. In our plan, we're saying that the National Development Plan's infrastructure target of 30% to GDP by 2030 is a trajectory that should be followed. And in fact, we say, after our modeling, we can actually increase it from about 14.5% where it currently is to 22% and bring unemployment down by 37%. So we've modeled this. We need to obviate the need for us as SA Inc. to take on more debt. And that means that the private sector needs to continue doing what it's doing, which is to illustrate to the government that because it has a human capital problem and a balance sheet problem, that the private sector can play a role. And we just have to land that. And it's not binary. It's not handing over the family silver. So one of the suggestions we've made is, if you take our ports, for example, we should think of a leasing model where the private sector can bring people and capital and run it commercially and hand it back to the state in 30 years or however long it will take. So the private sector needs to continue to illustrate to the states that we are partners with government and that we can bring solutions that can bring relief to the people of South Africa in the short term whilst we rebuild the state. And we just have to keep on that theme, because that's our way out of here currently.
Well, Roger, thank you very much. It's a very interesting manifesto and great pleasure chatting to you. I certainly hope that once you have finalized your decision, that you keep the momentum up, because the momentum was impressive given the short period of time of only 3 months. But we're going to have to leave it there. Take care.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Well, that was Roger Jardine, one of the founders of Change Starts Now, in this week's episode of the Monocle Banking Podcast. Again, before we go, I'd just like to extend our gratitude to you, our growing audience, for tuning in. Please remember to like, subscribe, and share the content, and reach out to me at The Badger on Twitter or email the team at Monocle.